I'm excited tonight to be kicking off our new series, Seasons of Faith, and we're going to be walking through what is possibly and probably my favorite chapter, my favorite book in Scripture, Psalms, or as Derek says, Psalms, yeah. We're going to be talking about all the ups and downs and twists and turns that come with the journey of following God. There are 150 Psalms, and they narrate the human experience of highs and lows. And there was a theologian in the 4th century by the name of Saint Athanasius. Really worried about pronouncing that. Saint Athanasius, thank you. He said this. He said, most scripture, most biblical text speaks to us, but the Psalms speak for us. They are a journey through human emotion and human interaction with God. Is there any way we can turn maybe these lights down a little bit? I know I'm always the one that complains about the lights, but I can't see anyone. The Psalms are categorized lots of different ways. There's lots of debate, like if you want to break them up in 8 different categories or 5 different categories or 4 different categories. But for this series, this is what we're going to walk through, these different kind of Psalms. We're going to talk about Psalms of joy and thanksgiving. And these are praises to God for his righteousness, for his faithfulness, praising God just because he's God and he's in control. Oh, thank you so much. And then we're going to do Psalms of wisdom. These are Psalms that help advise us and instruct us. And as we're walking towards God and we're seeking God, they strengthen us. And as we are on a journey and sometimes we feel really far away from God, these Psalms redirect us. And then we're going to focus on Psalms of Lament. That's where we're going to land tonight. Lament. Perhaps as Athanasius, suggests, where the Psalms speak for us best are the Psalms of Lament. So what is it? What is lament? Well, lament is a passionate cry of loss or pain, sorrow. It is an exclamation of total and utter grief and despair. And then it is a call for God to do something about that. It's a little bit like bossing God around. There are personal laments where it's just you and God processing and grieving together and you sharing that with God. And then there are community laments where all, like whole nations will come together and lament destruction or terror, kind of like we're doing after that shooting yesterday at that synagogue in Philadelphia. Why, God? Why? There are actually more Psalms of lament than any other kind of psalm, almost double what there is of joy and thanksgiving. And all the prayers in Scripture, in any book, there are more prayers of lament than there are praise. And that fascinates me. And I feel like it's worth noting and worth paying attention to. I think it means something, this whole crying out to God thing. When I was dating Herschel before we got married, despite everyone's best efforts, despite all the training I had in schooling and relationships and human interaction, and I'd seen lots of marriages before me, I really had this belief that Herschel and I really wouldn't struggle. Like it just wouldn't be, I see the married people giggling in the room. Like it just wouldn't be that hard for us, you know? I mean, I knew we would face things together, and I knew life wasn't roses and rainbows, but I was so caught up in this feeling and in this season of goodness that I wasn't really able to see there being anything else. No heartbreak, no hurt feelings, but there were lots and lots and lots of them. And I had this idea, perhaps it was cultural or maybe self-imposed or self-taught, that I needed to just kind of hold my tongue and be a good wife and not really like get into any conflict and not say much when things came up and just do my, wifely duties, which if you know me at all, you're like, yeah, right, Lee. But just not really get into it. I didn't want to cause a fight that would get into something bigger and turn into a bigger fight. So I was afraid that if I showed my real frustration to Herschel, that this monster in me of anger and rage would scare him away. And And I remember one time I had asked him to do something for me. It was particularly important. It was around our finances, and I trusted him to get it done. And I came home that afternoon. I expected to find that he had done what I had asked, and I'm sure you can guess what happened next. He didn't do it, right? And I was livid. And that is the nicest way I can say how I reacted. I felt actual hurt inside that he had let me down. But I brushed it off as I do, and I put a little distance between us, right? But as time went on, that distance and that bitterness grew and festered. And then someday we had this random little argument. There was an infraction. I'm sure it was over Herschel's driving. That's usually what our fights are about. And I just had a come apart. This small little thing turned into this massive fight, and I was a blubbering mess, and I began to just let out everything Herschel had ever done to offend me or anger me. And, he's like, what is happening? And I'm just rattling off things. And my dramatics usually, they stopped as they usually do. And we entered into this real conversation. Why did you let me down? You're the person that I trust. How could you? I know you love me. I know you want to help me. But you didn't follow through. And that sucked. That hurt. And all of a sudden, as we began to enter into this honest, calm conversation, freedom sort of settled over me. And I think that telling the truth does that. I think it releases this burden into space that offers rest and offers healing. And I think that's exactly what the Psalms of Lament are. They are Psalms of honesty. Psalms of telling the truth. But to whom? We've already said that lament is a cry of pain, sorrow, grief. It's putting words to our longing or our loneliness, our hurt feelings, or our heartbreak. And I know there's a lot of you in the room that aren't so good at that. You don't really want to talk about your pain at all. And then there are some of you in this room, some of us in this room, I include myself, who are actually really good at sharing our pain and telling people how hard things are for us and how dark things are. But hear this, both groups, wherever you find yourself. Lament is not complaining. Lament is not complaining. I have a master's degree in complaining. Anybody else? I have got a gift for complaining. Complaining, though, is when we take our pain and our frustration to one another. Lament is when we take it to God. Hear me say that again. Complaining is when we take it to one another. Lament is when we take it to God. And this is when it gets kind of crazy to think about that there are more laments and psalms than any other kind of psalm. There's a whole book about lament in Scripture, which is what? Lamentations. 2 if you count Job, right? That was one huge lament. There's something to this. Don't you hear the importance of telling the truth? Of crying out to God with your pain and your discomfort and your despair and your doubt? It's not as if he doesn't know it. He knows it. But telling him, being raw with God, crying out to him, that creates a bond. That creates intimacy. So you can't just go and be brutally honest, deeply raw with just anyone. In fact, some of you in here might tell me you don't have anybody that you can be completely and totally honest with. I did not until I got married. Full disclosure. But God can handle it. He wants you to share your heart, your real self, the good and the bad, honestly. Let him be your person. Trust him with your pain. See, our society doesn't really like pain. We like to gloss over it and pretend it's not there. Remember that whole argument with Herschel and I? Like, let's just pretend that didn't happen. And I heard this quote the other day. This is a little bit of a side note, but it like got into my soul and hasn't left yet. So I feel like I want to share it. But it said we have in America sort of this cultish type obsession with progress, with striving, with perfection, with go, go, go. Pick yourself up. Get back to normal. But those things, this is what he said, don't make us more Christian. They make us more American. They don't make us more Christian. And sometimes, and I know that this might go against everything that you've been taught, but sometimes the very thing that we need to do is sit in our pain. We don't need to go anywhere or be anywhere other than right in the middle of it. And I know that culture is telling you, pick your head up, go, keep trucking, keep moving, keep striving, progress. But God says, hey, daughter, let me hear it. And hey, son, I want to hear from your heart. The ways that you feel let down, the ways that you feel forsaken, forgotten. God can take your why questions. You're not a bad person. You're not faithless when you doubt. God can and wants to take your honesty. When your mom or dad gets a diagnosis, when your relationships are absolutely on the verge of death and you feel like there's nothing you can do to resurrect it, or when your depression or your anxiety gets you so deep and low into the pit that you see no way out. Lament. He wants to hear the cry of our hearts. He's interested in us taking our complaint straight to him with honesty, with humility, with trust. Psalm 102, I want to read some of it to you. It's a long one, so I'm not going to read all of it, but I want you to hear this. It's unclear who wrote Psalm 102. A lot of the Psalms are written by who? David, right? And they're not clear if this is written by David. Perhaps maybe it was Nehemiah, maybe it was Daniel. There's lots of debate about who wrote this. But what we know about this person is they were deeply, deeply afflicted and deeply hurting. And this is what the scripture says. Lord, hear my prayer. I'm crying out for help from you. Don't hide your face from me. Listen closely to me. Answer me, Lord. I'm calling out to you. My heart is suffering. It is withered like grass. I stay awake night after night after night. I can't sleep. I feel like I'm all alone. It feels like you've picked me up, that you've thrown me to the side. It feels like I'm living in this great big shadow, and I'm withering away. This psalm is particularly meaningful for me because it reminds me of a similar season in my life where I felt like God had forgotten about me. And I've talked openly with you guys about my journey to becoming a mom. And I know, and I struggle a little bit with sharing because I know this isn't super relatable to the season of life that you find yourself in. But it's my story of deep, deep pain. And I know we can all relate to feeling hurt. Herschel and I knew that we wanted a family right away. We got married a little bit older, and so we didn't want to wait super long to have kids. And I never really worried much about the process because I have felt since such an early age that God had called me to be a mom. And not boastfully, but honestly, I really trusted that. So I didn't really worry about it. And then it didn't happen. And we went to countless doctors. We had every test imaginable run. We went for second and third opinions. And I'll never forget the day that a really big test came back for Herschel and I. And this was sort of the last resort. And we had just finished lunch. We were pulling into our garage, and I got a phone call, and it was from my doctor. And it was my actual doctor. It wasn't a nurse who usually sort of gives you results. It was my doctor. And she said, hey, I wanted to explain to you myself what we're seeing. And she shared, and she said, you know, I've been in this field for 22 years, and I've never seen this. And she began explaining that our situation limited our chances of having a child on our own to about 0.02%. And she told us, I've never seen anyone with your odds have any hope with fertility treatment or any procedure. You're just really incompatible with that. And I have never, ever in my life felt a pain so deep. I wept and I wept and I wept. And I know it's really hard for you to think of that pain because you're not there. And I know it's even harder because you know there's another chapter to my story named Sellers. But all I had ever wanted was to carry a child into this world. And that day felt like the end of the world for me. I was a zombie. I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink, I couldn't sleep. I remember Lindsay being here, and she pulled me into her office, and she just told me, I feel led to pray for you. And I told her, I said, Lindsay, I have not slept in 3 days. I would wake up at night and stare at the ceiling, just sobbing. I didn't want to close my eyes. I felt paralyzed. The dark felt really scary and uncomfortable for me. And what you might not remember is simultaneously while I'm walking this road of deep and utter despair, there were lots of other people that were celebrating the fact that they were pregnant. 5 people on our staff got pregnant the same month. 2 of them in the youth department. Literally, we shared an office. One of them was my husband's boss. On the same day, 3 days after we got this call from the doctor, separately, both Herschel's college roommate and my college roommate called to share that they were expecting. They were getting everything I wanted. I will never forget having to grin and bear it through that news. One day, I couldn't hold it in. We were eating lunch in the cafe, and one of the staff members shared, surprise! And I couldn't keep it together. And I literally ran from the table, and I don't run. I ran from the table to my office to find a place where I could just weep. And I'll never forget Adam coming in, and I turned around, and there he was, and he just grabbed me and hugged me and said, I'm so sorry. Over and over. Everyone else had what I wanted. What about me? Why, God? Was I not faithful enough? Let me count before you all the faithful things I've done. Why me? How me? It was awful. I felt a little bit like the writer of this psalm, like God had forgotten me, like he had hidden his face from me. And I couldn't find him anywhere, and I wanted relief, and there was none. And one day a faithful friend said to me, you know, God can take all of your anger. He could handle it. And I don't know why that just gave me permission to just let God have it. My heart is suffering, God. I'm withering away. I'm hurting. I feel all alone. Do you not see me? Listen to me. I'm calling out to you. And I began to feel release. And honestly, I began to feel it a lot more quickly than I thought. I felt God become my safe place again. And I don't mean to tell you that I don't hurt or I didn't hurt anymore after that. Just yesterday, one of Herschel and I's really good friends had a baby. And we walked into St. Thomas Midtown into the room, and there was Megan, our friend, holding Liv on her chest. And I had a lump in my throat. And I just thought, that's probably never going to be me. It still hurts. It's still hard. But my lament, led to hope, to trust. And see, the psalm started angry and crying out to God. But they don't finish that way. In fact, of all the laments and psalms, only one starts and finishes angry, and that's Psalm 88. Usually they follow a process. The writer says this later in the same passage that I read to you earlier. I'm withering away. God, I'm angry. It feels like you've thrown me to the side. And then it says this. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your fame endures generation after generation. And you will rise up, God, and you will have compassion. You will pay attention to the prayer of the destitute. You will not despise us. You will not look away. We will dwell securely, and your children's children will be established before you. The psalmist cried out to God in grief and complaint. He then asked God, listen to me, God. I'm talking to you. Listen, answer me. And then he petitioned God, act on my behalf. Do something about this. And then he remembered God's goodness. All God had done in his life, in history, and he recalled his trust for God. And that move from hurt to hope, please don't walk out of here thinking it's speedy or it's simple. Lament gets really honest about how dark darkness is and how lonely loneliness is and how grievous grieving really is. But naming it and bringing it to God's throne room opens up space for God to meet you there. And over time, we walk into a new space with God. And God doesn't erase our grief, but he does redeem it. And for me, God redeemed my grief through a brave and selfless woman who carried my child into this world, the little boy I call my son, and the one who made me a mom, just as God had promised me. God can handle your honesty. Band, you can come back up. God can handle your honesty. What pain in your life do you need to allow God to enter into? What do you need to get really real about? What do you need to be honest before God about? Just on the way here today, after I'd written my talk and I'd been home and I was driving back, I felt convicted about something that I haven't been honest about, that I've been worried about, that I've been fearful about, but I haven't taken to God honestly. What is that thing? I pray that tonight you won't leave campus without asking God to convict your heart about what that is. What do you need to allow God to enter into? As we close, I want to share a story with you. Story of the Spafford family. Many of you have probably heard this story. But they lived in Chicago. It was a man, his wife, and his 4 daughters. This is a true story. And they lost everything in Chicago to a fire. And they made plans to rebuild their life, and they were going to move from Chicago to France. And so the dad got all these plans together, and this was a long time ago, and so their travel was by ship. And so he said, I'm going to put my wife and my 4 daughters on a ship, and they're going to go ahead, and I'm going to meet them in a couple of weeks when I get everything tied over here in Chicago. And so he did. He sent them on their way. But on the way, their ship was hit by another ship. And his wife and his 4 daughters lost their life. And their boat sank to the bottom of the ocean. And in grief and lament, as he was traveling on to France as they had planned, going the same route going over the same waters where he had lost everything in his life, he wrote a song, and you might know it. It's called "It Is Well With My Soul." And many of us know that hymn, and we've been touched deeply through the words that it expresses. See, he knew the power of praying lament. And his words have helped thousands upon thousands of people face their own grief and their own pain. He refused to let God go in the middle of his difficulty. Prayers of lament can look like complaining, but they can be prayers of faith because they refuse to let God go. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, we give you thanks